As civilians in eastern Ukraine try to escape the conflict zone, evacuation corridors are hit by sporadic gunfire and shelling. Russia waits to be heard as world diplomats discuss Ukraine's crisis at a NATO conference. That's as Washington calls on Europe to stop complaining and step up the pressure on Russia. And in robots we trust, an American pastor plans to show machines the way to redemption. This as some scientists predict artificial intelligence could ultimately endanger mankind. Hello there, you're watching RT International. You're with me, Katie Pilbeam. It's just gone 12 o'clock in the Russian capital. We start with eastern Ukraine, where people are fleeing the ruins of their homes during the ongoing shelling of the Donetsk region. But what's supposed to be a safe corridor for their evacuation turns out to be quite the opposite. Roman Kosarev is in Donetsk with the details.
The situation around the evacuation of civilians from Debaltseve is very dire right now. The sporadic shelling continues on the roads surrounding the area, but people here say that they're just forced to leave their homes.
It's very scary here. We are shelled from all sides. We don't know why. Schools, shops, homes, roads, everything is destroyed. We have no food, no medicine.
Although many families are brave enough to get into the buses and leave the area, the journey to a safer place is not safe at all. Just recently, our crew, alongside with other Russian journalists and anti-government fighters, we were caught up in a gunfire on that road.
По машинам и назад!
And basically, we were locked in the town of Uglygorsk for some time until it was safe for us to get out. But nevertheless, our entire crew were celebrating our second birthdays basically on that day. However, getting back to the refugees, it's no wonder that some of the residents prefer to stay home and hope the firing will end up sooner or later.
People are afraid to leave their homes because of constant shelling of the roads. There are also many bedridden sick people, families with small children. Many of them just don't have a place to go.
Nevertheless, the residents are leaving the area where the Ukrainian troops are encircled at the moment.
Meanwhile, authorities of the self-proclaimed Republic of Donetsk have cancelled today's evacuation of civilians over fears of further shelling. They also say that some Ukrainian soldiers that were encircled in this town here, as you can see Debaltseve on the map, have used the brief lulls in fighting to escape. They've managed to do so. Now, the leaders of the anti-government forces in Ukraine say they hope Kiev will be swayed to respect the Minsk peace agreement that was struck back in September following talks in Moscow. The leaders of Germany, France and Russia got together on Friday to try and hammer out a plan on diffusing the Ukrainian crisis. Now, the late-night talks lasted for over 5 hours and were constructive, according to a Kremlin spokesman. They will continue on the phone and include the Ukrainian president. Now, Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande already visited him in Kiev earlier. However, the US National Security Advisor hinted the Moscow trip wasn't an independent initiative.
They're not out there unilaterally cutting a deal with Putin at Ukraine's expense. That is a misperception, and I think we need to see how this evolves.
One thing the US and the EU apparently don't see eye to eye on is whether Kiev forces should be armed from abroad. Europe's Foreign Affairs Chief, Federica Mogherini, said in an interview that doing so would not be consistent with the push for peaceful political solutions. And even if it's being discussed in the US, it's mostly up to Europe to hammer out a solution. The topic of Ukraine is certain to dominate as the world's top diplomats descend on Munich for the annual NATO Security Conference. It's another chance for Russia and the US to try and find common ground. However, international affairs commentator Rick Rozoff believes the alliance is only interested in expanding eastwards and isolating Russia.
NATO plays an intrinsic role, an indispensable role in the ongoing war. The Ukrainian crisis, in fact, is a war. And what we've seen is that the crisis in the Ukraine has provided NATO with the pretext for moving further into NATO, something plans that were well underway far in advance of that crisis. What the U.S. has succeeded in doing with NATO expansion is to set up a military iron curtain along Russia's entire western border. It may not want to immediately bring Ukraine in as a full member of NATO. It's sufficient, as in the case with the country that has been paired by NATO and the United States for integration, Georgia. It's sufficient that these two countries be launching pads or operating areas, forward bases for U.S. and NATO operations elsewhere, particularly aimed towards Russia. Let's be very clear about this.
The topic of Ukraine is certain to dominate as the world's top diplomats descend on Munich for the annual NATO Security Conference. It's another chance for Russia and the US to try and find common ground. However, international affairs commentator Rick Rozoff believes the alliance is only interested in expanding eastwards and isolating Russia. OK, we have heard from him, so we are going to move on. While the Munich conference and Russia, well, they have quite a history. It was founded in 1963 as a forum for NATO member states to discuss global security. But it wasn't until 1999 that Russia, a non-alliance state, was invited to the conference. It used the opportunity to warn NATO against further eastward expansion. In 2007, Russia's President Putin gave a fiery speech there, slamming the US for trying to achieve global dominance, saying America was a threat to international law. 2 years later, the US announced it was changing its approach to Russia, extending a symbolic reset button in order to start new and better relations. Fast forward to today then, and the Ukrainian conflict dominates the Munich conference, with NATO blaming Russia and planning new bases further east. It's not just security and military superiority, but also economics. Russia's chief diplomat has spoken in Munich to Germany's finance minister. That's as the US keeps pushing for more restrictions to impose on Russia.
But this is a moment where the United States and Europe must stand together, stand firm. Russia cannot be allowed to redraw the map of Europe, because that's exactly what they are doing.
Joe Biden also said Europeans complaining about the sanctions are inappropriate and annoying. That statement coming on the sidelines of a Brussels meeting with members of the European Parliament, and reported in German magazine Der Spiegel. Political analyst Stefan Hughes says it's only natural that Europe isn't happy about the trade restrictions.
There's a gap between German, one line of German politics and the other, which is very closely linked to the USA, to what Washington wishes to attempt in the eastern part of Europe, and the other part of German capital, so to speak, which is interested in making good business with Russia. They've got investments averaging 25 billion euros. They are sort of a hostage to Merkel politics, and Merkel obviously is very closely linked to what Washington wishes to do. Surveys show that 18% of Mittelstand, sort of small business, are suffering severe damages from the sanctions. So this sort of the boomerang effect.
Plenty more stories ahead for you, including an updated national security strategy for America. Speaking on the priorities for the final 2 years of his presidency, Barack Obama confesses that US resources and influence are not infinite. Plus, a Libyan diplomat calls for the return of the country's monarchy, saying it's the best way to bring peace. That just ahead. Plus, dozens of dead dolphins and whales washed ashore in Scotland after a UK military operation. We have the details later on in the programme.